We've certainly come a long way from last year when you and I spoke several times on this show about a possible ceasefire and a possible end to the war being negotiated by the Trump administration in part. I think right now the fighting has simply continued, and one thing that European leaders, I think, will be very pleased with is that it does look like Trump has warmed up to Zelensky compared to where the two men have been in the past year and a half.
This evening, we're joined by the national politics reporter at the Wall Street Journal, Sabrina Siddiqui. Good evening, Sabrina.
Good to see you.
Really good to have you with us. Thank you. Quite a lot to cover today, actually. It was a busy morning for Donald Trump today. He hosted both the Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House. First up was Zelensky, who praised the meeting, where the two discussed the importance of protecting Ukrainians and how the US can help Ukraine with missile defence systems. Up next was Netanyahu. Much has been made of the relationship between the two leaders in recent months, with that sweary exchange between the pair. From Trump towards Bibi, really, in June, and whether the relationship has found itself on the rocks, really, because of the war with Iran and, potentially different war aims. The White House has said both meetings were positive and productive. How do we assess, then, Donald Trump's relationship with Volodymyr Zelensky? He facilitated, didn't he, towards Ukraine, the sharing of technology relating to drones, didn't he, a couple of weeks ago? So there was that, and still the relationship continues to be strong?
What's really interesting about these two meetings today is that while President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu once shared a closer bond, but have had a much more tense relationship against the backdrop of the war with Iran, President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine had started out with a much more tense relationship, and now we've seen that rapport thaw in recent weeks. And some of that has to do with some great reporting from my colleagues at the Wall Street Journal, saying that for more than a year, frankly, President Trump would in private insist when he was talking to his advisors that Ukraine was losing the war with Russia. But in recent weeks, President Trump has had this renewed sense of optimism about Ukraine and its capabilities and about Zelensky's leadership. That's according to reporting that my colleagues had out ahead of this meeting in the Wall Street Journal. Trump, essentially, according to aides, has been impressed with Zelensky's resilience, and it's obviously still can be a very fragile relationship, and sometimes people feel like Ukraine has sort of faded into the background with all the attention being fixated on the Middle East. But it's certainly opened up the door for Trump being more collaborative with Ukraine and in meeting its demands of the United States.
He seems to have sort of butted out when it comes to Putin as well. I think he was so determined to end the war. I know he promised to do it within 24 hours of taking office or something. I think he quickly realised that wasn't possible. He did try to push it through, meeting with Vladimir Putin. They had that huge bilat, didn't they, in Siberia, was it? And he has since sort of laid off Putin completely. He's almost stopped interfering to the same level.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Bilat in Alaska, sorry, forgive me. Go on.
And it's interesting because we've also seen all these twists and turns in terms of President Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin. And certainly we've seen a very different Trump in his second term in terms of his posture toward Putin compared with his first term. He has not been quite as amenable to Putin or as friendly with Putin as he was in his first term, which obviously, that relationship that they shared drew a lot of criticism from here at home in the U.S. as well as from Western allies. But what people close to President Trump often say is that his views can just change and evolve very quickly. And Vladimir Putin has in the past proven very effective, according to Trump's aides, at kind of pressing his case and persuading him to potentially be more amenable to some of the kinds of concessions that Russia is seeking to end this war. But we've certainly come a long way from last year when you and I spoke several times on this show about a possible ceasefire and a possible end to the war being negotiated by the Trump administration in part. I think right now the fighting has simply continued, and one thing that European leaders, I think, will be very pleased with is that it does look like Trump has warmed up to Zelensky compared to where the two men have been in the past year and a half.
Yeah, let's talk about the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Trump, because perhaps there was more tense feeling before that one. The idea that the two definitely don't speak as much as they used to, and they had that big shouting match, a big exchange of words back in June. I mean, both have said that it was a very productive meeting, positive. Have we heard anything else across reporting? Has anyone been able to get any further into this, Sabrina?
I think that it's a lot of the same, right? Yeah, productive, positive, that the two sides are in close coordination when it comes
I'm always
to
suspicious about
the
those
war
words.
in Iran. Yes, right. You have to be suspicious when, there's a suggestion that and this is from the Israeli government, that there really isn't much daylight between the two leaders, when in fact there is. One thing that Netanyahu's communications director told reporters is that there's no truth to the idea that Israel is pushing the U.S. in a certain direction when it comes to Iran. That Prime Minister Netanyahu is not telling President Trump what to do. They both want to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons. That's not exactly the sense that you get from the White House. Even if they're saying it was a productive meeting, it's been very clear that President Trump has been frustrated at what he sees as Netanyahu's influence or attempts to influence the direction of the war. And especially when you had that temporary ceasefire, which of course has now fallen apart, a sense from the Trump administration that Netanyahu was one of the factors standing in the way of a lasting ceasefire. So, it's not entirely clear that has changed. But compared to some of the leaks in recent weeks about how tense it's become between the two men, it seems like today it was indeed a more productive discussion, if you will.
Yeah. Okay. Well, both Zelensky and Netanyahu are in Washington to attend the first 2 days of funeral ceremonies for the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, the Senator for South Carolina. He died earlier this month. He was known as a foreign policy hawk. Graham was working on a new Russian sanctions bill and had recently travelled to Kyiv to meet Zelensky. Delivering his eulogy just over an hour ago, President Trump had this to say.
Virtually everyone, Republican or Democrat, liked Lindsey. Well, not everybody, but it sounds good. Not everybody. He was a tough cookie, okay? I have to veer from this for a second. He was a tough cookie, darling, but he was beautiful.
That is Donald Trump talking about Lindsey Graham. What else did we hear during this first day of funeral ceremony?
Well, I think that there were obviously, just a lot of tributes that poured in about Graham's life and legacy. Trump also said that Graham is a true American original. And, he was obviously someone who could be very polarizing in some ways, especially because of the way in which he became closer to the Trump administration over the years, despite being one of Trump's sharpest critics early on, before Trump ever took office. He also, of course, was in the Senate for a very long time and had cultivated relationships on both sides of the aisle. He was known as someone who would always be quick with a quote, with a snappy quote. And I think, he worked on a lot of issues. Foreign policy, of course, you mentioned, was probably where he had the most impact and influence, especially in Republican administrations, and in some ways drawing Trump, who came from a more isolationist viewpoint, into a more traditional neoconservative worldview.
Yeah.
But also, I think, he worked on issues like immigration. People forget that he was a co-author of this comprehensive immigration reform bill in 2013, where he worked, alongside Democrats and Republicans to propose a pathway to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants in the United States. So even though he was a staunch conservative, there were also, very notable moments where he did show a willingness to work across the aisle. But I think people will always be probably most fascinated by his relationship with Trump, especially in his final years.
Yeah. In his eulogy today as well, Donald Trump said that Lindsey Graham never saw a war he didn't like. And this feeds into an exclusive that you guys got a couple of days ago. It was footage that you were able to publish that showed Lindsey Graham's obsessive push for the Iran war.
It's interesting because I used to cover Capitol Hill, and it's under the Obama administration. And Senator Graham is someone who's been pushing for a war with Iran for a very, very long time. So I think, this is something that I think was always going to be, an issue where he would have a lot of involvement, especially because it was under the Trump administration, a Republican president who had held Graham pretty close as an advisor. And, he was very supportive of Ukraine in its war with Russia. He was also very much a Russia hawk, which is one of the issues in the first Trump administration where he and Trump had quite a few disagreements. But I think all told, I do think foreign policy is the piece of his legacy that will be remembered and dissected the most, because, of course, we have to also point out that there are a lot of people who would criticize his legacy on foreign policy because, of the civilian and humanitarian impact that U.S. military intervention has had in the Middle East and around the world.
And just finishing up quickly, Sabrina, on a video likely to get the president's blood pressure up further. It's been released by Tehran. It claims to show how best to target his wife Melania in an assassination. It was released by the Tasnim news agency, which is close to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The video begins with a slide reading "Where to kill Melania" before encouraging global freedom fighters to assassinate her, and ends with a warning to her son, Baron Trump, wait for us. Has Donald Trump responded to this at all?
I haven't seen President Trump himself directly respond as of yet, but Secret Service has said that they're aware of the video. They are not going to provide too much comment because they on the one hand, they have said that they investigate anything that can be perceived as a threat toward the first family, which is under its protection. But at the same time, because of their concerns for operational security, there's not a whole lot of detail that Secret Service is willing to go into about, how they might be investigating this video. But obviously something that the Trump administration is taking very seriously, even if it is designed to be some kind of propaganda.
Yeah, certainly.
Certainly not something that they're going to take lightly.
Look, Sabrina, great to speak to you. As ever, loads to discuss. Sabrina Siddiqui, who is the reporter for the Wall Street Journal, national politics reporter, to be more precise. Sabrina, good to have you on. Thank you.